everybody. Welcome to episode number 4 of the Clarity Project podcast. I am your host, 𝗦𝗢𝗓𝗓. So, for episode number 4, we're going to continue from where we left off. And this note that I'm going to read for you guys is from September 23 also of last year, 2022. So, let's get to it. September 23. All I have now is the blue one. From where do anger and irritability arise? Happiness fixes anger or disregards it. However, happiness is not constant. It does not stay. So, I guess this episode is going to be more about anger, on trying to understand where it comes from, trying to understand what we can do whenever we feel angry or that there is anger or hatred inside of our hearts. It may talk about a little bit and touch upon our notions, our beliefs, and our philosophy towards anger, maybe challenging those beliefs and seeing how true they really are. It's about understanding anger in contrast with happiness and its relationship with peace. So let's read further. How to deal with anger doesn't exist because by the time you hear it or feel it, it is already too late. If you have a grasp on anger, it simply does not arise. You are all of your emotions. There is no division. Anger, greed, anxiety, fear are not detached or separate from you. You are that. You are your emotions. There is a deep-rooted violence inside of me. Being violent and not wanting to be violent is conflict. Only deal with the fact you are the violence. Now, this passage talks about mainly about anger, but it also gives us a little bit of an insight on the other emotions as well. Probably because anger is one of the strongest emotions out there. It's one of the most explicit. Even though you try to hide your anger, it manifests itself in other forms and in other ways. We see it through our actions, and if not through actions, we see it through our emotions, our behaviors, and to the very least, it is what's inside of our head. It consumes what's inside of our head. It talks about anger in terms of how when you get a sense of it, once you feel it, that it's already too late because it has already happened. It talks about how anger simply does not arise, meaning it doesn't come to you, it is already within you. Now that could be seen as an unorthodox way of thinking because when we look at emotions, specifically anger, we usually think of it in terms of provocation, in terms of when other people do us harm or do something that's really bad to us, that we will feel bad as a result. It is a form of simply acting out what they did to us. And in that way of receiving something that negative and hateful, we do something that is reciprocate of that, which is anger. It denies this idea that anger comes from the external world or that anger comes from an outside force, action, activity, situation, whatever. It says that anger doesn't come from the outside. No, it doesn't come from the outside, but rather it comes from the inside. Meaning that if you are feeling anger, if you have anger feelings or anger emotions towards someone or a situation, it doesn't mean that someone outside of you provoked that. It doesn't mean that something outside of you made you feel angry. No. What this passage is telling us is that instead, anger was within your heart all along. Anger was inside of you all this time. What this passage is trying to tell us is that you could either have anger or not. The reason that you feel angry is that you feel anger inside of you. It says that you are all of your emotions. There is no division. Anger, greed, anxiety, fear are not detached or separate from you. Meaning that if you feel angry, it's not because of some external thing. It's because you have anger inside of your heart. If you feel greedy, it's not because of some external stimulant. No, you feel greedy because you have greed inside of your heart. And if you feel anxious or fear or any kind of emotions out there, it is not because of anything that's happening, regardless of the situation. It's not what's in the outside, it's what's in the inside. Now, if there's something that I could say about that thought, is that probably in most use cases, it's probably true, right? Because there are a lot of things that we feel angry about that we shouldn't feel angry about. There are a lot of emotions that we expend when, in hindsight, we realize that it's not worth our emotions, or it's not worth the effort of doing those and getting through all over those emotions, because it's not worth it. I believe that perhaps generally speaking, when we're talking about low level stuff, this is actually true. Because even though something happens to us that is not that extreme, you, or maybe you know a person who is always violent, who is always angry all the time, even through and because of the smallest details. Now, that is someone who is not operating well. That is someone who is angry all the time, who is violent all the time, who is harsh all the time, not because of the things happening outside of him or outside of her. Probably there's a discrepancy and there's a disproportionate and incommensurate balance between what's happening outside versus to what he's acting out, or she is acting out. If that is the case, then irregardless of what happens outside, it has little or nothing to do with how he or she will feel. It is entirely dependent on what he or she is inside. If you know someone who's like this, who's really violent, really harsh, and really angry all the time for apparently no real reason or no real justifiable reason, then probably this person has so much hatred inside of his heart. Maybe this person has so much anger inside of her heart. It simply feels like it's a manifestation of the famous notion of it's not you, it's me. In that case, it's really them, it's not you. And so if you're someone who's living with someone like that, or that you know someone like that, I could say that, that's a really tough situation to be in, and that it's really tough because it's really not you. It's not you. It's them that's doing all of those stuff, and there's really little that you can do about it, because it's not about what you do outside. It's about what's inside of them, and what's inside of them is probably, and most of the time, really buried deep into the blackness of the blackness void that you have to really uncover only for them. But it's only them that can help themselves, which is really tough. So, yeah. Again, the passage says that there is a deep-rooted violence in me. Being violent and not wanting to be violent is conflict. Only deal with the fact you are the violence. And so if you are a person who is violent and you're not doing violence, there's conflict there. If you are a cow who's doing non-cow things, then there's conflict there. If you are an extrovert and you are put in a situation wherein you can't be an extrovert, there's conflict there. The converse is true for introverts. If you're an introvert and you're put in a situation where you have to be an extrovert, there's conflict there. This passage basically tells us to be more cognizant of what's really happening, not only at the surface, but also be cognizant about what's happening inside, of trying to think much deeper on, rather than saying that this person is violent or that this person is angry all the time. It challenges us to be able to look at a person and ask, why is this person violent? Why is this person so hateful all the time? I want to know the deeper reason behind it. In that case, it's no longer inherent. In that case, it's not longer the other person's fault. And so it's also a form of self-reflection. of you looking at your emotions, looking at your tendencies, looking at what and how you feel, not only by yourself, but how you act towards other people. It's a self-reflection of sorts that lets you have a self-personal audit and how you're going to evaluate your life, on how you're going to evaluate how you treat other people, seeing how and what emotions always arise most of the time. It gives you a little bit of a guide on who you actually are, on what's inside of your heart. And so if you're a person who has a lot of happiness in his heart, then that's good. If you're a person who's a lot of jealousy or feels jealousy all the time, irregardless of what's happening outside, and there's an incommensurate balance between what happens outside versus what happens inside, then probably there's a lot of jealousy inside of your heart. At the same time, as a great caveat, I think this doesn't tell us that you can only be angry when there's anger inside of your heart, or that you have anger to begin with. No, because at the same time, I believe in the most extremes. If something is really bad that's really happened to you that deserves you for you to be angry, then yes, of course you're going to be angry, because anger can also be planted. Jealousy could also be planted. Happiness can also be planted to you. Maybe it doesn't grow and maybe it doesn't bloom right away, but eventually it will grow. Eventually it will come to fruition. Eventually you will feel anger, you will feel jealous, not because you had it to begin with, but because someone planted it, because someone cultivated it within you. You can learn to develop it, and at the same time, you could learn to have it in an instant. And so, yeah, this passage talked about how we should think about our anger, but also it gives us an understanding on how we should learn to think about our emotions. Sometimes it's probably a manifestation of not what's happening outside of you, but rather it is a manifestation of something that's happening inside of you. And so, yeah, that's probably it for this episode. If you watched the whole thing or you watched it in snippets, I'd like to be able to thank you, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you and goodbye.